In stillness we wait. Time's gentle embrace unfolds. Harmony is found. Here is how I made a phone case. Like most pears living in the 20th century, I use a smartphone on a regular basis. We're living in a pretty crazy time where these devices have become super thin and super powerful. As a maker, I'm very appreciative of just how elegant and beautiful smartphone designs have become in the last few years. However, in my opinion, there's been one very big threat to all this beauty and elegance, and that is smartphone cases. It seems that our solution to protecting our expensive metal bricks has been to slap a ginormous pile of plastic over them and call it a day. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand a lot of people like cases because they offer a means of customization and add personality to their device. However, I feel like a lot of these are just ugly as hell. They completely cover the design details of the device and oftentimes add a bunch of bulk and unnecessary weight. I like strawberries, but personally, I don't want to glue them to my phone. There have been some attempts at solving the weight and design problem, like the Arc Pulse case, but let's be real here. This isn't protecting shit. It makes your phone look like a college girl going to her first EDM concert. Now you might be wondering, why don't you just not use a case if you hate them so much? YouTubers like Marquise Brown Lee carry their phones naked all the time. Why don't you just do that if you hate having strawberries glued to your phone all the time? Well, these devices are freaking expensive. And to be quite frank, I don't have the funds to buy a new phone every time I slip on a banana and smack my phone on the ground like Marquez does. So, I need a case. A few years ago, I stumbled upon a Japanese case brand called Gild Design while watching a vlog by Miraie. If you don't know who Miraie is, he's a vlogger and music artist, and I use a lot of his songs in my videos. If you're watching this, Miraie, I love you, please don't sue me. In the vlog, he unboxed this aluminum lilac case, and this was just the sexiest thing I've ever seen. The case also looks very good too. I ended up going on their website afterwards, and I really liked their products. Their cases used a bumper design that seemed pretty effective against drops, even with the exposed surfaces on the device. And most importantly, their cases looked good. Now, before I continue, note that I am not sponsored by Gild Design in any capacity, and as you will see later, it's possible they might not even like this video. With that said, I really fell in love with their design and have been using their cases ever since. A few months ago, I got a new phone and I was super excited to get a Gild Design case for it. But when I went to their site, I found out they didn't make one for the iPhone 15 yet. I ended up stumbling upon a post written entirely in Japanese from the creator, I think, that said they were in the process of making cases for the 15 series and wouldn't be able to ship until January. But it was October at the time, which meant I had to wait a whole 3 months. In the meantime, I tried some other more traditional cases, but I really didn't like them. I ended up waiting, but in December, I got really impatient, and I sent them an email asking about when the 15 series case would be internationally available. They ended up sending me a PayPal invoice without replying to my email to pre-order the case, which was kind of sus, but I trusted them since it was from the same PayPal seller I got the 14 series case from before. Eventually, late January arrived and I still didn't get my case, and the impatient American in me came out and I emailed them again. This time, they gave me a reply saying my order would be shipped in mid-February, and I broke down crying. How could I possibly wait another 3 weeks for this aluminum masterpiece? Eventually, I decided I had to do something about this. While the Gild bumper case looks very beautiful and futuristic, at its core it's a pretty simple bumper case. Given my computer-aided design experience, I thought maybe I could make something like this myself. After all, I'm Chinese and it's in my blood to make worse versions of existing products in the market, so it was only natural that I try to make my own version of this case. With that, I made it my 1-week mission to spend my time after work making my own phone case. To be totally honest, when I sat down in Fusion 360 to start designing this thing, I was super lost for the first hour or so. Unlike a lot of the other monkey brain designs that I've made in the past, this case would actually need to fit my phone with a reasonably good fit. On top of that, I needed to make sure it was at least ergonomic enough to carry around on a daily basis. After aimlessly thinking for a bit, I decided it would make sense to first model the phone itself and then go from there. I decided to look online for my phone's dimensions instead of measuring them myself because I was really lazy. Given that the iPhone is so popular, this was fairly easy and I was able to make a brick that resembled my phone pretty quickly. Once I had the phone itself modeled, I started sketching the shape of the case. Just like the Gild design bumper case, I went with the approach of designing protruding corners with the intention of using these as mounting points for the screws, or in my case, bolts and nuts, to hold both halves of the case together. While it would have been very aesthetic to keep these protruding corners very tight, I didn't want to buy new parts for this build, so I ended up modeling them with the intention of fastening the ends together using M3 bolts and nuts that I had lying around. These are the same ones I used to make the projector remote mount I talked about in my last video. After getting the rough sketch figured out, I extruded the sketch around the phone and then subtracted the phone as a negative from the solid I made out of the case sketch. This would ensure that the inside of the case would fit my phone exactly, or at least as well as it could. I then added some more details like the holes for the shaft of the bolt to fit through, and also added holes so that the head of the bolt and nuts could sit somewhat flush with the surface of the case. I then added holes around the side faces of the case so that it would look more like an actual bumper case. In addition, I curved the edges of the case to ensure that the edges wouldn't be too sharp and uncomfortable to hold. Then it was just a matter of splitting the entire case in half so that it could be printed in two parts. The last thing I added were some really small protrusions and holes against the inner ends of the case so that the two halves of the case could fit together and snap. This is a neat technique I remember from taking apart a bunch of plastic toys growing up, and I was excited to see it do its magic in this build as well. From there, I bought some gray PLA filament and sent these straight to my 3D printer. The first thing I did after pulling the first piece out of the oven was clean it up and test fit. The fit on the phone was pretty decent on the first try, but there was a much bigger issue. It seemed like the protruding corners were way too thin to actually fit the bolt and nut mounting holes. As a result, the corners weren't filled properly and looked kind of broken. It almost looked as if the printer ran out of filament when printing the corners, but the reality is that it was really just too thin to actually print consistently. I ended up going back to Fusion 360 and increasing the size of the corners a bit to fix this issue. I then threw it back into my printer and got these parts. While it seemed like the corners of the print were no longer crusty, when I tried to add hex nuts into the mounting holes, they didn't fit. After remeasuring, it seemed like I severely undermeasured the footprint of the hex nuts, so I had to increase the size of their mounting slots, which also meant I had to increase the size of the corners again. While this obviously looked a lot less aesthetically pleasing, I was getting pretty annoyed by the size corrections at this point, so I just increased them anyways and got printing again. Finally, I ended up with these parts, which seemed to fit somewhat well. I spent some time cleaning up the parts real good with some angle clippers, sandpaper, and alcohol swabs. And once those were all nice and smooth, I put my phone in between, added the bolts and nuts, fastened the two halves together, and boom, it was alive. After assembly and putting everything together, the first thought I had was, damn, this case is freaking ugly. While the general idea was pretty much the same as the Gild design case, there were several decisions that made this thing an eyesore compared to the original, at least when you look at the details. First off, the round and bulbous corners were not flattering at all. My design was definitely a lot prettier before I increased the radius of the corners to fill out the edges. After all of those increases, the corners just ended up looking like Mickey Mouse ears, and it really took away from the overall aesthetics of the case, made it look kind of goofy. If I was more serious about this project, I probably would have opted for using bolts and nuts with a smaller diameter, probably something like M2 over M3, which would have allowed me to keep the radius of the corners much smaller. Second of all, the bolts I used were slightly too long, which made them stick out of the back of the case. While this wasn't noticeable most of the time, it kept getting caught on fabric inside my pockets, which was a huge pain and almost ruined my clothes. Another big issue with this case was that it was pretty uncomfortable. I used this case for an entire day, and it was a noticeable downgrade from a touch perspective, even compared to the more traditional cases I was using at the time. While I did round off the corners of the case in Fusion 360 using fillets, I probably should have been more aggressive since the edges of the case still felt really sharp and jaggedy. In addition, the sides of the case felt rough because the layers of the 3D print were rubbing against my fingers. If I used something like ABS, I probably could have done something like a vapor polish to make this feel more smooth and comfortable. On the bright side though, the roughness did make the grip surprisingly decent. The other weird thing I experienced is that the sides of the case were also flimsy and flexible. If I squeezed against the edges of the case, I could literally see and feel the bumper moving over the screen, which felt weird and cheap. I printed this part with 30% infill, and it's possible that at a higher infill percentage, mixed with a more rigid printing material, that may have solved this problem. But the material I went with, PLA, didn't seem rigid enough to keep the edges in place. The last issue was kind of unexpected, but it was the acoustics of the case. Whenever I received a vibrating notification, the case would make a weird rattling sound, even despite the bolts being very tightly fastened. You can hear it pretty clearly in this clip, but it sounds really unpleasant. I think this weird noise occurred because the hollowness and flimsiness of the plastic echoing the vibrations, which I admittedly wasn't really thinking about when picking my print material and also the infill settings. Needless to say, this project was kind of a failure, but funnily enough, while I was assembling the case for the first time, the real deal actually arrived at my doorstep, which is pretty ironic. It seems that my impatience led to a project that ended up wasting just enough of my time to allow Gild to fulfill their order. On the bright side, this means we would get to compare my monstrosity with the real deal. Unboxing the Gild design case gave me a roller coaster of emotions. On one hand, I was super excited that I would finally be able to ditch my homemade piece of crap soon, but on the other hand, I was also very fearful of how embarrassed I would be about my design skills, seeing the difference between the two cases side by side. To my surprise, when you place the cases next to each other, they actually don't look astonishingly different at first glance. I guess it kind of makes sense given that I modeled my design after theirs. However, as soon as you start looking at the details, the quality difference is really obvious. The Gild design case is made out of solid aluminum, which not only looks a lot better, but feels a lot better since you don't have plastic layer lines rubbing against your skin while holding the case. After installing this thing on my device and picking it up for the first time, it's insane just how much more ergonomic and comfortable it feels to hold compared to what I made. They added pretty aggressive fillets on the edge of the case, which made it feel more comfortable, though at the expense of some grip. They also hid the screws from the front and angled the corners downwards, which made the design more interesting. Furthermore, there are a lot of more tiny details all around the case, like accented cutouts around the camera bump and buttons, and I also appreciated that they included rubber corner bumpers in order to add some shock protection if the device is dropped. Overall, Gild has once again reminded me why I spend so much money on their products, and why I make scuffed YouTube videos instead of starting a phone case business. If there's anything I took away from this experience, it's that there are a lot of subtle design decisions that are hard to notice in products until you try making them yourself. With that said, I don't regret this project since it makes me feel a lot better about spending $70 on this case. Thank you, Gild, for making such an awesome product. I'm a loyal customer and will stay that way now that I know how much work you guys put into making these cases so great. If you for some reason want to print out the case I designed and try it out yourself, the link to the file on Thingiverse is available in the description below. If you also want to order a Gild design case, which I would highly recommend, especially after I have gone through this project, that will also be available in links in the description. Thanks for watching. Pear out.